Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Sexton. I'm the president of New York University. As we enter this century, we work through the first decade now. It seems to me that one of the great issues that faces humankind is how we as humankind will develop as a community. It's clear now that the world is miniaturizing. Gating strategies don't work. We've just learned that about our economies. But gating strategies don't work in any domain, it seems. The migration of people and culture and certainly ideas. So the world is miniaturizing, and we're all interconnected at this point deeply in ways that perhaps are surprising to some. And the question is, how are we going to handle it? Is it going to explode in a clash of civilizations, or is it a great ecumenical moment, a chance for us to develop a new concept of community, a community of communities? Today, our university, with the Clinton Foundation, stands where universities and President Clinton always have on that question. We stand on the side of ecumenism and hope. It's a time when it's difficult to have hope, but we have deep hope. And we celebrate today an exemplar, a reason for hope, something that worked where no one thought it could because of the commitment of a formidable set of people, and of course by President Clinton himself. For me, welcoming President Clinton back is a consistent joy. The relationship with the university goes back. Major conferences held here when he was president in which he participated in 1998, 1999, through honorary degrees, through his and the Secretary's role as now NYU parents. We're just delighted to have him here. And the celebration of Dayton is a personal one for me as well, because everyone involved in the team was a star, but one of the supporting players in it was a young man, a then rising career diplomat who's my wife's brother, and he's now risen to be Assistant Secretary of State. So we're delighted as a university to welcome you, and we're delighted to welcome the distinguished guests here to our campus. President Izetbegovic and President Josipovic, we welcome you in particular, and of course we welcome a member of our family, President Clinton. So please join with us today as we go on to celebrate this great diplomatic achievement and some of the people who made it possible. Thank you very much.
For much of the 20th century, the Cold War framed American foreign policy. When it ended, the nation was faced with a new challenge, defining the role it would play on the international stage at the dawn of the 21st century. The global institutions, built for the Cold War era, were not prepared to handle Europe's next great crisis. After the Soviet Union's collapse, Bosnia descended to ethnic warfare as Serbs, Croats, and Bosnian Muslims battled over territory. New to office, President Clinton focused on ending the war.
It's in the American interest to limit the conflict to Bosnia, to try to restore humanitarian conditions, to see that a bad example is not set, and to limit the refugee outflow. Those are the things we are trying to do.
But despite the efforts of the international community, the crisis deepened. In the summer of 1995, President Clinton sent Ambassador Richard Holbrooke with a team of senior American officials to lead a new effort to end the bloodshed.
We've got a window of opportunity which is small and a window of danger which is large. It's an uphill struggle, but we are committed to it and we think there's a chance.
After several months of shuttle diplomacy, the presidents of Bosnia, Croatia, and Serbia arrived on the grounds of the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. Over the course of 3 exhausting weeks that November, the negotiators brokered an agreement that ended the war.
On behalf of all of us who would come to see this peace take hold, you have seen what war has wrought. You know what peace can bring. Seize this chance and make it work.
But back at home, opposition remained. The Accords required the deployment of 60,000 NATO troops, 1/3 of them American. Polls showed that 70% of Americans opposed deployment, and many on Capitol Hill rejected the president's proposal.
It's outrageous to think that we have to put men on the ground to again rescue educated, intelligent, cultured Europeans from slitting one another's throats.
The risk to the lives of our troops far exceeds any national interest the United States could possibly have.
President Clinton responded.
As the Cold War gives way to the global village, our leadership is needed more than ever, because problems that start beyond our borders can quickly become problems within them.
President Clinton's determination prevailed. In cooperation with both Russia and its NATO allies, the American presence in Bosnia ended the war and laid the groundwork for lasting peace. And the efforts at Dayton, facing down what might be considered one of the first great challenges of post-Cold War diplomacy, set the stage for America's leadership in the decades ahead.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to introduce Mr. Samuel Burter, former National Security Advisor under President Clinton.
It's my privilege this morning to set the stage for our discussions and to introduce the person who paved the way to Dayton and beyond. When President Clinton took office, the war in Bosnia was already raging. The images: snipers, systematic rape, widespread ethnic cleansing, skeletal prisoners behind barbed wire, horrors in Europe we thought had been banished forever. Yet at home, there was not much appetite for a distant war. And abroad, our European allies steadfastly resisted tougher measures that might put the humanitarian mission at risk. But by mid-1995, Bosnian Serbs shelled innocent families in Sarajevo, massacred thousands of men and boys in Srebrenica, took UN peacekeepers hostage. President Clinton concluded that American leadership was the only hope for peace. And so that August, we began an all-out diplomatic initiative, backed by the use of NATO force to shift the balance of power. Its early weeks were scarred by tragedy. First, the deaths of 3 American diplomats, and then a brutal mortar attack on Sarajevo. But NATO's relentless airstrikes, together with Bosnian and Croat gains on the ground, finally led the parties to a ceasefire, and to Dayton, where for 21 days, our negotiating team, led by our extraordinary ambassador, Richard Holbrooke, pushed and prodded and pressed and persuaded and finally prevailed. After nearly 4 years of bloodshed, 100,000 killed, more than 2 million displaced, the leaders of Bosnia, Croatia, and Serbia turned the page from war to peace. And yet for President Clinton, another battle was just beginning. The president had pledged to send 20,000 troops to help NATO implement the agreement. But most Americans opposed the idea. Many within the military were skeptical. Much of Congress was dubious at best. Dick Armey declared that winning the support of the House would be like pulling teeth through the back of your head. And in fact, the House refused to take action in support of the mission. And yet the president moved forward because he knew it was right. We had helped to end a terrible war. Now we would lead for peace. It has been said that courage is not simply one of the virtues, but the form of every virtue at the testing point. And to be sure, President Clinton showed political courage in seizing the initiative to stop the bloodshed and in doing what needed to be done to enforce the peace that had been so hard to secure. But Bosnia was also a reflection of his values at the testing point, his abiding belief that prosperity and progress must be rooted in unity, not division. He had a vision for Europe and the transatlantic alliance at a time of historic transformation. It was a vision of a peaceful, undivided Europe as we neared the end of the century that had seen some of humankind's worst brutality taking place on that continent. And he knew that such a Europe could never be born with a fire raging at its heart. With all that has happened in the last 15 years, it's easy to forget how bold that thinking really was. There are many steps along that road. Nothing was preordained, especially not the peace agreement we revisit today. The president also had a vision for U.S. leadership in the world. His belief in the power of our common humanity and America's unique potential as an active force for peace. He drove the administration's effort from the Balkans to the Middle East to Northern Ireland, from Eritrea and Ethiopia to Burundi, from Peru and Ecuador to South Asia and South America. And now, in his post-presidency, he continues to champion a world where interdependence works to everyone's advantage, and where those who are blessed with the benefits of today do more to spread the benefits and shrink the burdens. As he says, the success of our work is measured by a single question: are people better off now than when we started? 15 years after Dayton, we know that in Bosnia, the answer to that question is yes. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to introduce President William Jefferson Clinton.
Thank you very much. Please be seated. Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, and thank you, Sandy, for the introduction. I'd like to thank a number of people. First, I'd like to thank the leaders from the region who have come here and who will be represented on the second panel and whom I will introduce later. I want to thank all those here who served in the administration during those early turbulent days, some of whom will be on the panel shortly. I'd like to thank Warren Christopher and Tony Lake, who played pivotal roles in the resolution of the Bosnian crisis, who could not be here today. And I want to acknowledge those who aren't here, whom we missed. First, Dick Holbrooke, who had looked forward to dominating this whole proceeding today. And the three brave public servants we lost on August the 19th, 1995, on the Mount Igman Road, Joe Cruzel, Bob Frazier, and Nelson Drew. Ron Brown, Chuck Meissner, and all the people at the Commerce Department and the business community who were lost on the plane in Croatia, their families are here. And I hope that what we do today is a reminder of what could not have been done then without their loved ones. And there are a lot of people, for all the fits and starts of that policy, who are alive today because of their service, and I am profoundly grateful. I'd like to thank John Sexton, the president of NYU, and all the people here for hosting us again, and I'd like to welcome the students who are here, many of whom may be too young to remember what happened after the breakup of the former Soviet Union. The conflicts between the Serbs and the Bosniak Muslims, the Serbs and the Croatians, the conflicts in Bosnia and in Croatia. But then, the killing in Bosnia dominated the news, much as the demonstrations in Cairo and other cities in Egypt are today. Before I introduce the panel, I'd like to put into some context what all this means and go just a little beyond what the film did. Many people seem to think that the 1990s and after the Cold War and before 9/11 were a peaceful, uneventful interlude between the Cold War and the dawn of the struggle against terrorism. I think those of us who were there would beg to differ. First, in Bosnia alone, it understates the sheer scale of the destruction and the killing. In a small nation, 250,000 people were killed and more than 2 million people became refugees. Secondly, the Dayton Accords, the military action, the NATO resolve to act where we did, was really the first test of what the world would do to order itself in the aftermath of the Cold War. The Cold War dominated the organization of America's foreign policy until about 2 years before I was inaugurated. The struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union created a whole architecture of diplomacy, military support, intervention or lack thereof around the world. During both Republican and Democratic administrations, our policy was driven by what was generally called containment. Containment to me meant two things. First of all, that we would try to contain the spread of communism to the confines which existed at the time any given president took office. And secondly, we would try to contain the dimensions of the conflict so that the two nuclear superpowers did not ever use nuclear weapons. It was a useful and often productive construct, and we didn't have another nuclear war. I've often said, only half in jest, that on the nuclear issue, it may be that each country's spies were the other's best public servants because they did their jobs well enough that we knew enough to avoid the war. On the ground, when it came to geographical containment, it often led to contortions of our values. When everything got pushed through a narrow funnel in terms of whether this or that or the other conflict would or would not advance the interests of the Soviet Union. It led the United States into supporting extremely repressive regimes in Central America and into the Iran-Contra problem. It caused us to see the Vietnam War through the blinders of the Cold War struggle, I think, too much early on. And there were all kinds of other issues which we're not here to discuss today. But after it was over, there was a big issue. Now, how would the world organize itself now that it was no longer bipolar? And what role would the United States play? How would we manage the outbreak of ethnic and racial and religious conflicts, most vividly and bloodily represented by Bosnia? What about Russia? How were we going to relate to Russia? The Russians had political, cultural, and historic ties to the Serbs. Is there any way they could be involved in the resolution of the problems in Bosnia and later in Kosovo? What did it mean for the dream of a Europe united, whole, and free for the first time in history that the worst killing since World War II was taking place on the European continent? What about NATO? Could NATO have a non-Cold War mission, and should it have more members? How should the United States view its interest here? Secretary Jim Baker, whom I admire very much, once famously said when referring to the Balkans, the Europeans should handle it. It's their problem, and we don't have a dog in that hunt. How should we view Africa? How should we view Latin America now that we no longer were twisted and contorted by the Cold War into supporting repressive regimes in Central America, having problems like what happened to Lumumba in Congo? All of these things had to be worked out and worked through. And you could have all the theories in the world, but there had to be a specific example that informed us about what we could and couldn't do. So in the Balkans, and in Bosnia-Herzegovina particularly, there was an enormous humanitarian issue at stake, and one it was harder to escape. Now, you know, when we see Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and 24-hour CNN coverage of what's going on in Egypt, it's hard to remember that the Balkans may be the first conflict that was a long way away in a small place where we actually knew what the heck was going on all the time. We didn't have anything like the level of interactive communication and instantaneous information transfer then we had now. When I took the oath of office, there were only 50 sites on the entire internet, and the average cell phone weighed 5 pounds. That's embarrassing every time I say that. It makes me feel ancient. But the point is, the things you take for granted now about how the world got swept up in what's going on in Egypt, it was a new thing in the Balkans. And it meant that deniability was not an option for the United States and other great powers. And it's important to keep that in mind. Well, I thought we did have a dog in the hunt there. Number one, because I thought in the aftermath of the Cold War, the United States had to redefine its relationship with Europe and with NATO, and that all of our pretensions that the crumbling of communism would lead to a great burst of enlightened democracy, freedom, prosperity, and security would have looked like a fraud if the rest of the world did nothing to help there. I thought on its own merits, because we knew we had an obligation to try to reduce the slaughter, reduce the flow of people thrown out of their homeland, restore decent conditions, and again, recreate the possibility that Europe could find its way to a prosperous, secure, democratic unity. As you saw from the film, there were a lot of people who disagreed with me on both sides of the aisle. And there were a lot of people that thought that by doing this, getting involved, the United States was blowing a chance to claim the so-called long-awaited peace dividend. That if we just could get past this conflict with the Russians, we could dramatically reduce our defense expenditures, invest in long-delayed infrastructure and other needs at home, deal with the problems of our cities, of our minorities, improve the performance of our schools. And getting involved here was just the beginning of a slippery slope that was, in the words of President Eisenhower, giving in to the imperatives of a military-industrial complex. There were people who thought it would be another Vietnam. There were a lot of people who believed that this whole thing was a fool's errand, and that in general it was foolish for us to be involved. You saw the film said 70% of the people were against our sending troops there. Even after the whole peace accord was completed, after Dayton was signed, the opposition was 58%. The first thing I did when I became president was try to put together an aid package for Russia because they couldn't even afford to bring their soldiers home from the Baltic states. 74% of the American people were against that. 81% against aid to Mexico. 3/4 of the House of Representatives voted against our aggressive early involvement in Kosovo after we had gone through the agony of Bosnia. This was a very tumultuous, contentious time. There's a lesson in all that, by the way, which is that for the politicians, people hire presidents to win for America. And in foreign policy, you have to put your oar in the water toward what you honestly believe is in the best interest of the country and is in the best interest of our values and the world. And if you're right, it'll all come out all right. And if you're not, it doesn't matter if what you did on day one was popular. And I'll never forget when people thought I'd lost my mind by helping Mexico, because 81% of the people were against it and we just lost the Congress. And I said, oh yes. And 2 years from now, when we have another 1 million or 2 illegal immigrants and drugs are flowing across the border and everybody in Latin America hates our guts, and people ask me, why did you do that? My answer will be, well, there was a poll in the paper today. I had to make the decision that 81% of the people didn't want me to do it. I say that as a cautionary reminder, especially to all the young people here, because again, we are dealing with a lot of complex situations where we have limited control but some influence and a lot of variables. The president has to do what he thinks is right. The people fundamentally expect us to do that. And I'm not saying you should ignore popular opinion, but if you know something that most people don't, and you can see around a corner or two, you have to do what's right for the nation and the world. And the more interdependent we get, the more that becomes true. So that is the context in which this occurred. And I should say one other thing too. I was also roundly criticized by people who had more moral consideration on their side for not doing this sooner than I did. Warren Christopher went to Europe early in 1993 and tried to build support from the Europeans for being more aggressive when there were a lot of diplomatic efforts going on, which the panelists can tell you about. And I kept working at this because the objective was both to stop the killing in Bosnia and give them a chance to make it, and to maximize the chances of a united democratic Europe. I did not believe we could do that if America acted unilaterally. But just so you understand, and I'm not criticizing other people and trying to paint this thing in a totally rosy scenario, there were a lot of people who hit me day in and day out because they said, you know, the longer you take to act, the more people will die. The longer you take to act, the more people will become refugees. But I felt the only way the peace could endure is if we did it with Europe, with our NATO allies, with the support of the United Nations. But I think it's important to put that out today, that we were getting it in effect from both sides. So I ask you to think about that as I bring on the first panel. The panelists are Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, who before that was our ambassador to the United Nations and was always, from day one, an aggressive supporter of American intervention in the Balkans. General Wes Clark, who wore many hats and later became the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, but at this time was our principal military negotiator in all the peace process with Dick Holbrooke, and who was on Mount Igman Road that day when we lost those three fine people and was indispensable to this work. Ambassador Peter Galbraith, who was ambassador to Croatia in 1993, mediated the agreement in 1995 that ended the conflict in Croatia and helped to end the Muslim-Croatian conflict within Bosnia-Herzegovina. He has gone on to do a lot of other things, including overseeing elections in Iraq. But I wanted to say one thing, because I encouraged Peter to say this. He was also at the center of a big controversy about what would happen while the conflict was still raging before we could get the international community involved, in terms of whether the Croatians and the Bosniak Muslims would be wiped out in Bosnia because there was an international arms embargo, which seemed to make sense. Oh, the world has an arms embargo to minimize conflict. The problem is it was a fraud, because the Bosnian Serbs were being supplied by Serbia, which had its own weapons manufacturing capacity, and therefore the arms embargo operated only in effect against one side. And the Europeans were unwilling to lift the arms embargo to look like we were supporting an arms race and even greater carnage. We didn't want the battlefield to predetermine the outcome of negotiations. And as you will hear, I'm sure today, some Serb reversals on the battlefield led to a balancing of interests which made the peace agreement possible. Anyway, Peter Galbraith was at the center of all that. That included $1 million congressional investigation into whether we had done the right thing by not vigorously enforcing the arms embargo enough. And that's a euphemistic description of what we did. So I thank them all, and I'd like to thank Ron Brownstein, the distinguished American columnist for the Los Angeles Times and other outlets, who has been involved in all this from the beginning, who was intimately involved in the coverage of my '92 campaign and when we began to raise all these issues in public debate in an election context for the first time, for his willingness to come here and moderate the panel. So let's welcome the panel and get on with the proceedings.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, everybody. I'm Ron Brownstein, Editorial Director of National Journal Group, and the President has introduced our distinguished panel here. Let me start with an issue that President Clinton raised, because the title of our panel is The Dayton Accords and the Beginning of 21st Century Diplomacy. But the Dayton Accords are not the beginning of the story in Bosnia. During the last 2 years of the George H.W. Bush administration and the first 2 years of President Clinton's administration, there was a great deal of uncertainty about how to proceed. Richard Holbrooke, who we've mentioned several times, wrote on the very first page of his memoir about Dayton, "Between 1991 and 1995, the international response to this catastrophe was at best uncertain and at worst appalling." Why did it take so long for the U.S. and Europe together to intervene with decisive force in Bosnia? Secretary?
Well, I think, first of all, let me say, I think from listening to President Clinton, you all know how fabulous it was to work for him. It was every day exciting, and you could see how his mind worked and how dedicated he was to what he was doing, and it was an honor and a pleasure to be able to work with you, Mr. President. I think the hard part has to do with the fact, as he said, that we were so focused on the Cold War and fighting the Soviet Union. The other part is that there had been the Gulf War. There had been a war. We had won it, apparently at the time, in a way that tired the people out. And at the same time, there were a lot of other things going on. I think one of the hard parts when you look back at history is that you forget a lot of the context. We had a humanitarian relief operation in Somalia. There already began to be the refugees coming out of Haiti, and something was happening all the time. And as the president said, people were ready for a peace dividend. They did not want to get involved, and we had spent 50 years looking at the world through the Soviet prism. And besides, and I take this very personally, I wasn't born in the United States, I was born in Czechoslovakia, and for me, Munich was a very essential part. And people used to say, why should we do something about a country that we can't pronounce in a faraway place? And all of a sudden, the same issue was going on in the Balkans that were described as a bunch of tribes that had never gotten along. And so people didn't know why they should do this. And so I think the president had talked about it's the economy, stupid, and then also there were all kinds of other issues. And I think it was hard, as he said, to motivate people, but you have to understand the context of so many other things going on at the same time.
Peter, your perspective from a position on the ground on these initial years and what inhibited action?
Well, it's striking, and President Clinton discussed the criticism, which on the ground I heard every day. Why aren't you doing more? You're the one country that's in a position to do this. And frankly, at the beginning, there was disappointment with President Clinton, who had, in the campaign, indicated that he would do something. But the situation had become more complex than when he spoke in August of '92 about lift and strike. And that is because a war had broken out in Bosnia between the Croatian forces in Bosnia and the Bosniak, or as they were called then, the Muslim forces, the government. And as long as that war continued, there was no practical way for assistance to get through to the Bosnian government. And so when I arrived, I was one of President Clinton's first appointees to arrive on the scene. My job was to try to minimize the violence between the two, to stop the atrocities that the Croatian-backed forces were committing against Bosnian prisoners, get humanitarian supplies. I sent a cable the first week, which I included a joke, described the situation that was going in Sarajevo, a appalling situation. The joke that was going around Sarajevo was, what's the difference between, the Serbs had cut off gas to Sarajevo, which meant there was no water, no way to boil the water on the ground, puddles, cholera epidemic. The joke that was circulating was very grim. What was the difference between Sarajevo and Auschwitz? At least in Auschwitz they had gas, perhaps tasteless. I put it in a cable, it went to the president. He issued an ultimatum in July of '93 to the Serbs, who turned back on the gas, and that humanitarian crisis was diffused. The next step was to end the war between the Muslims and the Croats. We succeeded in doing that in negotiations that took place in Croatia. A lot of pressure on the Croatian President Tudjman, who wanted to divide up Bosnia, but he was persuaded to change course. We got the alliance between the two in the Washington Agreement, signed in President Clinton's presence in March of '94. And then came a critical decision, which President Clinton discussed, and I'd just like to say a word about that. President Tudjman came to me and he said, the Bosnian government, President Izetbegovic, whose son is here today, has asked what would be the U.S. attitude if we permit arms to transit our territory to go to the Bosnian government. And some of them are coming from Iran, he said. but that wasn't, most of them were coming from the black market, actually from Russia, interestingly. And President Clinton took the decision, which I thought was the right one, and I carried out, to tell Tudjman, we don't object. He actually had hoped, I think, for the opposite decision because he didn't really like the end of the Muslim-Croat War. He still had territorial ambitions there. The arms began to flow. When I saw President Izetbegovic, just before he died, he said that was the single most important thing the U.S. did that led to peace, because it reversed a situation in which the Serbs had all the arms and were in danger of being exterminated. The battlefield changed, and so I think it was a very significant set of steps, the Washington Agreement, this decision, that led to Dayton. It wasn't something that happened all of a sudden in '95.
General Clark, what about the military posture in these years? If we're thinking about 91, 92, 93, 94, I mean, it's hard to generalize, but was the military primarily a force skeptical of greater involvement, or were there key decision makers who thought that they could play a useful role in helping to bring this to a close?
Well, before I answer that, I just want to say what a pleasure it is for me to be here with Madeline and Sandy Burger and Peter Galbraith, and especially with President Clinton, because when I think back on those years, there really was unified leadership in the United States government. There was a man in charge who had vision, he had courage, and he really took us to where we needed to go. The military wasn't really part of that vision. And, I mean, we were, Colin Powell explained it when he was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and his attitude sort of came down to the rest. He says, I tell him, he says, I go to the meetings and I say, tell me what you want us to do, and I'll tell you what it takes. But I'm not going to help you do the policy. And so the military was in a sort of reactive mode in this. I got there in the spring of 1994, and every weekend there was a crisis. I mean, it was one challenge. It was North Korea. It was Haiti. It was a shoot down of aircraft in Bosnia. I had no idea, because from the outside you couldn't see any of this. And inside the military institution, we were still recovering from the war in Iraq. We were digesting the lessons learned. We were into precision strike, high technology. If you could see the ground, you could control it. And we were also wrestling with the bad memories of Vietnam. And there were two bad memories in particular that stuck. One was the so-called Weinberger Doctrine, which actually General Powell cooked up in the early 1980s, which says you've got to have decisive force. We called it overwhelming force at first, and that was too much, and it became decisive. And so we had a tendency to worst case what the opposition would be. And we would, there were some quotes of people saying it would take hundreds of thousands of troops to solve this problem, and you can't afford it, so let's stay out of it. And there was also a sense that maybe that there was an idealistic strain in the American political scene, but when the going got tough, and you started to take casualties, the idealists wouldn't be with you, and the military would be blamed. So therefore, let's be very cautious about getting committed. So that was the military posture, and all the things that Peter was talking about here. The military, they were bystanding.
Actually, on balance, though, you're describing a posture that is not so much reactive as resistant on those two final points. Can I ask you? Go ahead.
Can I have to pick up on this, and I have to start this by saying that Colin Powell and I are very close friends.
And you have a famous quote, however.
Right, but what happened was, and I think Peter was saying he was on the ground, and that people kept asking him what's going on. I was at the UN. I was known as Multilateral Madeline, and basically, every day people were saying, why aren't you doing something? And I actually saw more different diplomats than any other American diplomat. Whoever was ambassador in Germany would see more Germans or whatever. But I would come to meetings and talk about this. And so, as I said, it was the end of the Gulf War, and Colin Powell would come into our meetings. He's big, handsome, medals from here to here, the hero of the Western world. And I was a mere mortal female civilian arguing with him about the use of force. And I kept saying, you've got to do something, and we'd have these arguments, and he's a brilliant briefer, and he had his little red pointer, and he would take us up a hill, and we'd be able to take it, but it would take a zillion troops and a zillion dollars, and what would I say to Sergeant Slepchak's mother when he stepped on a landmine? And I finally said, what are you saving all these soldiers for? And he got furious at me. And he wrote about it in his book, and he said I practically gave him an aneurysm from this, and that he patiently had to explain to me. So his book came out, he had left, we had used force, we'd won, and so I called him up and I said, Colin, patiently? And he said, yeah, I had to do it patiently. You didn't understand anything. So then he sent me his book, and he wrote Love, Admiration, etc. to Madeline, and he signed it, patiently, Colin. So I then sent him a note back, and I said, Love, Admiration, etc., and I signed it, forcefully,
Yes,
Madeline.
there you go. Let me ask you about one factor you didn't mention in your list of issues in this early period, and I think it goes to some of the comments the former president made. The initial sense in both administrations was that the Europeans should take the lead on the problem. And as you mentioned, as I think the president mentioned, Warren Christopher, Secretary of State, went over to Europe in the spring of 1993 for a very unsatisfactory series of meetings that left without a clear direction or a plan. It seemed, in addition to the factors that you mentioned, in those first months, the administration was struggling with what was the right balance in the post-Cold War period between consulting with allies and leading allies.
Well, there clearly, I mean, the president talked about wanting to create a Europe that was whole and free. Frankly, that was something that the first President Bush had been working on, and we really did think that the Europeans were ready to take some responsibility. They were doing pretty well economically. NATO was functioning, and I think we had a sense this was in the heart of Europe, and why couldn't they do something about it? And it was very frustrating. And at the UN, it was very frustrating because the Europeans there, I would go to a European ambassador, I'd say, I need your help on a vote, and they would say, can't help you because the EU does not yet have a common position. And then 2 days later, I go to the same person, I say, can you help me now? And they'd say, can't help you, the EU does have a common position. So it was very frustrating. And I think the comment that President made about Jim Baker had in fact kind of thought that they would be able to handle it. This was not our fight, but it was very, very hard. I think we did learn in this that we needed to know what we wanted to do before we went to consult, that you needed to figure out how the system worked. But what I think is so interesting about all this is that the President talked about this. This was a period of institution building. I loved being ambassador to the UN because what we thought was that the UN really could function in a way that it had not been able to during the Cold War because it was paralyzed by the veto, and that peacekeeping operations could in fact supplement or take over at the beginning on military activities. And it was a very exciting period in terms of looking at institution building that we thought was the beginning of the 21st century. I do think we all heard more than anybody, President Clinton kept building bridges to the 21st century. And so this was one of the aspects that we were looking at, and it was very, very deliberate. And it was deliberate to expand NATO, and it was deliberate to use alliance structures and the UN to be able to deal with the post-Cold War problems.
Peter, from your perspective, where you were, the idea of Europe taking the lead on this, did that seem to you a plausible outcome, or were you dubious of that from early on? How did you kind of assess that?
There was a huge failure of institutions. Richard Holbrooke, whose wife Kati is here, and I like to say hello to her, he described this as the greatest failure of collective security since the Second World War, in the sense that the idea of the UN, it really was a collective security treaty. If there's a country that is an aggressor, we all gang up on the aggressor, and presumably the aggression's deterred. It had worked against Iraq when it invaded Kuwait, and it was failing here. The Europeans had said initially in '91, when this war broke out actually in Croatia, and let's not forget the president of Croatia is here, 15,000 people died in that war. That's Europe's second deadliest war since the Second World War. But the Europeans said, we'll handle it. And then they sent a troika, that was the leadership of the European Union, that consisted of Luxembourg, Portugal, and the Netherlands. In an environment in Eastern Europe where military power counted, that was not a very impressive representation of Europe. I don't mean to fault the individuals. It was how the European system worked at that time. And so certainly by '93, people in the region had given up. What gave the U.S. so much power was first the impression that had been left from our very spectacular military success in Gulf War I, the sense that we were invincible. And one of the things about having all this military technology is that it's great until you actually use it. When you get bogged down in Iraq and in Afghanistan, then it's not so impressive. But in those days, it looked absolutely terrific. And second, we were the last resort. And so when I would carry out my diplomatic assignments in démarches, sometimes I felt like, you know, it was almost the voice of God here. And because people would never say, no, we won't do it. Tudjman would never say no. He would say, oh, yes, yes, you're exactly right. We'll try to do better. And then when I'd come back a few days later, nothing had happened. And say, well, we did our best, but we couldn't get it done. So we had enormous influence in this particular situation, which probably was may well be unique.
General, so when we begin, so in 1995, when we take a more assertive role and a stronger leadership role in driving NATO toward the bombing and using all of the tools of diplomacy, what is the reaction of the Europeans, and particularly the Russians as well, as we move, I think, as the Secretary said, from kind of a consultation to saying, this is what we want? How do they react when we take a more assertive role?
Well, first of all, the President had a very good relationship with President Yeltsin, and this set the basis for everything, and we knew that. But there were different strains in the Russian government that we came across. We had a member of the we had the Russian ambassador to the contact group, who was the foreign minister, Igor Ivanov. And Igor was a wonderful guy. I used to swim with him at Dayton every morning, and he spoke a little bit of English, and I spoke a little bit of Russian, and he was well-meaning, and he would be passed, Richard Holbrooke would pass him the memos and say, Ambassador, take a look at this. Igor, don't you like this? And Igor would quickly scan it, and we think he understood it, but he wouldn't be able to object. At the Russian military level, they were very cynical of what we were doing, but they also knew it. I was on a trip to Moscow in the middle of the Dayton talks with Strobe Talbot, and my Russian counterpart came up to me and he said, you Americans, we know what you're doing. He said, you say you're going into you're going into Bosnia. He said, and that's our part of Europe. And you say you'll be gone in a year. Mm-hmm. And I said, oh yeah, that's it's all right. Please, we're Russians. We know better. Said, but don't worry, we would do the same thing in your position. So they viewed it as part of the geostrategic chess that was going on. They didn't like it, but they tolerated it, and because we had guys like Igor Ivanov, who was very Western-oriented and tried to make the relationship work and deepen the understanding that President Clinton had with Yeltsin, we brought the Russians on board.
The journalist in me wishes I could bring the former president back up stage for this question, but I'm going to ask it to you, Madam Secretary, because it goes to what you were saying before, your very interesting point about consultation with direction versus kind of consultation, kind of, casting around for ideas. I'm wondering, do you view the decisions of '95, the whole road to Dayton, the bombing, the concentrated diplomacy, as a change in President Clinton's and the administration's view of how America was to pursue its role in the world? Was it a turning point in his, perhaps on the way toward your terminology of the indispensable nation later in the decade?
Well, he's actually the first one that said indispensable nation. I just said it so often that it became identified with me. But the bottom line here is that I believe that it was an evolution, that President Clinton, I remember when I got interviewed for my job at the UN, and President Clinton made very clear to me that he saw American leadership within a setting where we worked with other countries, that in fact was the force multiplier, that the U.S. in conjunction with our allies could do much more than just unilaterally telling everybody what we were supposed to do. So I think it was an evolution, but there was a way of figuring out that if the Europeans and the others were kind of being really dilly-dallying, I guess is the best word, that we in fact did have to take the leadership role. But it was a very interesting way to think about how things should be done. As Peter said, the truth is that the first President Bush had, in fact, done a good job on building the coalition on Iraq. But that was a good model. And then what President Clinton did, I think, was take it to the next level, and that we did know when we wanted to do something, how to do it. And frankly, Ron, what we did was I teach a course on this, we used every tool in the national security toolbox. Clearly, bilateral diplomacy, multilateral diplomacy. We used the law. We created the War Crimes Tribunal. Law enforcement. These people ultimately were indicted. We used carrots of aid to countries if they decided to help. We used sanctions. We used the threat of military force, and we used military force, and we used Richard Holbrooke. So I think that this really was an amazing way
host unto himself.
Right,
Yes.
and of using a set of tools that one has in conducting it, but mainly we had a president who directed it and believed it and understood the role that the United States had to take.
Peter, from where you stood, did the way the administration approached this problem in '95 represent a change or an evolution from the way they did when they first came in?
It was an evolution, but I think it's important that we have a broader appreciation of the historic record, because there's a lot of talk about the bombing as being the turning point. Not at all. What it was actually a Croatian military offensive, Operation Storm, that took place in August. That involved, and this is the way the world is, some pretty tough moral choices. The Croatians had threatened, there was an enclave in Bosnia, Bihać, with about 160,000 people. In November of '94, the Serbs they surrounded it completely, because it was also part of occupied Croatia on one side. The Serbs were squeezing it. At that time, the Croatians had indicated they might launch an offensive to liberate it. The question came to me. The instructions I got were very strong. Tell them, no, we don't want a wider war. Then came, in July of '95, Srebrenica, the murder of 7,000 men and boys. The danger the same thing would happen in Bihać. The same question from the Croatians. And frankly, our concern was that instead of 7,000 in Srebrenica, we might see 40,000 men and boys murdered in Bihać. But we also knew that given Tudjman's nationalist behavior, that there would be consequences for the population in the Serb-held areas which Croatia was going to attack. It was a tough choice. We made the choice. We gave the Croatians a no light, which they interpreted as a green light. It changed the military balance. The peace plan, Dayton, was based on a 51% for the Federation, 49% for the Serbs. When Serbs had 70%, they had no interest. When they all of a sudden had 45%, they found 49% a lot more interesting. The NATO bombing helped, but it was a series of steps that led to that.
General, let me ask you about the role of NATO in this, because obviously Bosnia is a turning point, and we're using the word evolution, in NATO's evolution, and we see it move in other directions after that, Kosovo, Afghanistan. Talk about Bosnia and its impact on NATO's vision of its role and the way it operated.
Well, NATO had already done some missions in the Bosnian area, so we had two exercises. We had an air exercise and we had a seaborne exercise. We just weren't on the ground as NATO in the '94-'95 period. Britain and France both had their forces under UN command in Bosnia. And in the summer of '95, after a failed Bosnian offensive to break out of Sarajevo and then the counterattack by the Serbs, which impacted UNPROFOR, the new French president decided he would reinforce, and the British went along with it, so they put some artillery on top of Mount Igman. And suddenly the British and French role became very muscular. The previous idea on peacekeeping missions has been, these are forces, but they're blue-hatted, and they're not really military forces. They're there to provide assurance. But with the presence of artillery, suddenly they became much more muscular. This was the beginning then of talking about a real NATO role, because if you're going to talk about real forces, then you need real command and control and real logistics and real reconnaissance and intelligence, not just bands of soldiers with blue helmets. And so then in the summer of 1995, after the Srebrenica a massacre, then everybody got very serious. When the negotiations started, we began also to deal with NATO as the alliance and talk about a prospective NATO role in the occupation.
Did, you know, you talk about the period after the agreement. I mean, there was a lot of skepticism originally about whether this could hold. Even in the book, Richard Holbrooke describes the first months as rocky. And yet it has endured, probably more than many people expected at the time. What allowed this to ultimately take root?
Well, first of all, I think that the people wanted to have peace. I mean, the killing there was really dreadful, and the stories that both Wes and Peter have talked about, and President Clinton, and I think that they were ready. But also there was international support for it. It was rocky, but I mean, the Europeans took part, the UN took part, we obviously did an awful lot. But it wasn't simple, and it continues not to be simple. I have to tell one story that just exemplifies this. In '97, when I became Secretary of State, I went to see Tudjman, and we were trying to work out a way that out of Bosnia there could be a way out through a bridge that came from Brčko. And I asked his permission to get this bridge open so that Bosnia wouldn't be totally landlocked. So there was going to be a big ceremony, and as you know, according to the Dayton Accord, there were 3 prime ministers. So, and this is a true story. We get there, and one of my press assistants had wanted a picture of us on the bridge. And there were a lot of suits around, and nobody had on name tags. And she finally said, okay, would everybody who's a prime minister raise his hand? So 3 people raised their hands, the others left, but it was an example of the problem. So I think the issue was how, in fact, you could get this complicated system to work, and it still is an issue, and I hope that our next panel actually we talk about it. But what it showed to me is that you can't always check off a problem as done. It has to be managed, and in many ways the international community has been a part of this, needs to continue to be a part of this. But what we learned in Bosnia, we also took to Kosovo, and what we're trying to do now is to bring Serbia and this whole region into Europe and go back to the original idea of a Europe that is whole and free. And that came out of Dayton and all the various evolution of this.
Peter, your assessment of the period since the Accord?
Well, I think I'd like to say something about what it was that was accomplished. First is something very much in human terms. I saw this almost every day. 40 kilometers from Zagreb, there was the front line, and there were refugees living in mined houses, children, babies dying for absence of medical care between the contested sides. Never mind the massacres that were that occurred from time to time, and that ended. It also, I think it wasn't a sure thing that this was going to end. It wasn't a sure thing that Dayton was going to be successful. There was a lot of skill, and again, I wish Richard Holbrooke were here on the panel because he really had a huge amount with the accomplishment, along with the support from President Clinton and others who were involved, and his team. But let's consider what the alternative might be. We might be discussing here in 2011, year 20 of the Bosnia-Croatia wars. Croatia is a Lebanon, as a Cyprus, in which Serbs occupy a part of the country in a state of permanent hostility. Bosnia, as a source of ongoing conflict, no doubt a hotbed for terrorism. The impact that might have had on Europe. I mean, it was profoundly demoralizing to Europe, never mind the presence of the refugees. The impotence that what it would have said about the UN. And frankly, the UN mission in UNPROFOR mission, while it kept people alive, it was a failure in its broader purposes. So there was a lot that resulted from this success. And while the Constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina as a unified state is far from perfect, and these days you hear a lot of criticisms of Dayton and of the Dayton Constitution, the fact is that at Dayton we were not seeking to create a perfect country. We were seeking to end the war, and we did. Nobody has died in hostile action since 1995, in 16 years. That is a remarkable achievement.
That is. And let me ask, our time is beginning to run down, so I want to ask two forward-looking questions. Let me start with you, Madam Secretary, because you noted that this was a case where we used all the tools in our toolbox. It really became a casebook study in what some call coercive diplomacy. I mean, military force, diplomatic pressure, consensus building. Obviously, the circumstances are very different today, but is there anything that model can tell us or that can apply to the challenges we face now in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, even with the unrest in the Arab world? Are there lessons from that kind of integrated approach to the other problems we face today?
Well, I do think that, first of all, you know, I have said that there are not a lot of tools in that toolbox. I mean, here we are, the most powerful country in the world, and there are really not a lot of tools. But what I think we have learned is to try to use them together. And I was asked to help on developing the new NATO strategic concept. And what is interesting is they took the lessons of the Balkans to some extent into Afghanistan to talk about what they call a comprehensive approach, where in fact you do the military and civilian activities together, where you learn lessons that you cannot solve all the problems militarily, that you have to have a civilian component in terms of reconstruction, in terms of the political work, in terms of getting the population to understand what is going on, and also to have the alliances work. And I think that is one of the ways that the lessons can be learned about how you use which institution, but you need to mix and match on these tools. And I think that that is finally what is going on. But it is not easy, and it is not easy, and I think Sandy Burger can speak to this better than anybody, as to how to keep the American system together in terms of getting the bureaucracy to agree on something. We had some internal issues. And I think that you need to move the process forward, but it's internal to the U.S. and then consultation with the allies. But it has to be done in a way where you know what you want, as I said. And sometimes you actually call up an ally and say, wouldn't you like to suggest that instead of me suggesting it? And it sometimes goes down better.
General?
Well, I think you have to have the right conditions on the ground. And that's one of the most important lessons from Dayton, is that not only did we use all the tools in the toolbox, and did we adroitly consult with allies and friends and others in the region, but we set the conditions. And I want to go back to what Richard Holbrooke did. Because at one of the critical moments when the Croatian offensive was really grinding forward, Richard called, and I don't know whether it came from him or came from Washington, but we marched in on a Sunday morning. He went to see Tushman, I and Jim Pardue went to see the Minister of Defense. We said, stop. And I remember the Minister of Defense said, wait a minute, we're about to take Banja Luka. They're in complete disarray. They're shooting, there's deserters in the streets. Milosevic has sent a new general to take charge. This is the opportunity. We'll be in Banja Luka within a week, and we'll have over. And you want us to stop? He said, stop. And they stopped. Of course, after that, it never got going again. But that was the 51-49 boundary. And the Serbs didn't know that it couldn't get going again. And Richard saw that, and he got the conditions on the ground set. The other thing about this, when it's forward-looking, is you've got to have the right personality. You've got to have the ability to put all the pieces together. And Richard Holbrooke was the right personality, and he did it at Dayton, and he did it with a lot of help from a lot of people, but it was solely his responsibility to make it happen inside that Dayton, and he basically conceived it and did it. There were a lot of us who saw pieces and bits of it. I couldn't begin to tell you all the pieces of it, but he bullied and cajoled and wheedled and flattered and did everything in the world to bring those groups together, and finally got President Izetbegovic to make the key concession on Birchko at the end. So even when you use all the tools, and even when you set the conditions right on the ground, and even when you've done all the rest, there's a certain amount of chemistry, a certain amount of pressure that has to occur to bring the agreement to a close.
Peter, you've obviously been very close to the current challenge as well as being involved in the Bosnian challenge. Your thoughts about whether there's anything that can teach us about what we're dealing with in Afghanistan and Pakistan?
Let me turn to that, but I'd just like to add something to Wes's story, because I listened to the tape of the meeting that Dick and I had. We met with Tudjman alone. Where did I listen to it? In the War Crimes Tribunal, one of 4 trials that I testified at. I have to say, Wes, it wasn't quite as unambiguous as that. But any event, what was extraordinary was the fact that at the outcome of this, what were these trials? When the tribunal was set up, every journalist said to me, oh, this is a cynical exercise because you aren't really prepared to do something. And yet, all but 2 of the people who have been indicted have gone to The Hague or are dead or died in the process of being arrested, have gone through this process. And I have to tell you, as a diplomat, there is nothing that has given me more pleasure than testifying at those trials. Normally, what you do is you take a lot of abuse from terrible people, and some of these were terrible people, and in the end, all you can do is, when you finally retired, write your memoirs that nobody's going to read, and they're probably already dead. I got to put people in jail. I mean, real justice. Now, the second point I would make about your question, because I've actually been involved in Iraq and served in Afghanistan, what are the lessons? I think one big lesson I'd say is don't try to apply too many lessons. What came out of Bosnia was a sense that the elections were held too soon in Bosnia. The nationalist parties won. And that lesson was then applied to Iraq, where we had a prolonged occupation, which was a disastrous course of action. In my view, we would have been much better off in that case to have had quick elections. And frankly, from my experience in Afghanistan, I can't see anything that's really applicable to Bosnia, except perhaps this point. In Croatia and Bosnia, we had partners. And having partners is key to success. In Afghanistan, we don't have a partner, and yet we have a strategy that requires a partner, and that's why it isn't working, in my opinion.
One final thing. We're down to our last few minutes, but I want to start with you, Madam Secretary. It wasn't exactly, even though the President talked about where the internet and cell phones were, it wasn't exactly a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, but it was a different world in the sense that people talked about the 90s and early part of the 21st century as kind of a unipolar moment when the U.S. was really unchallenged with any other nation for world supremacy. Is the model of how we pursued our goals in the world then still applicable to today when we are talking about a much greater diffusion of power? Is the vision of the U.S. as the indispensable nation still the way we should be trying to lead the world today?
Well, first of all, I think you have to remember there's nothing about the definition of indispensable which says alone. It just means that you have to be a part of it, engaged. And part of what I meant when I said it, I think the President too, is that the American people needed to understand that things that happened in some faraway place actually affected us at home, and that our engagement was something that was very important. I believe that continues to today. But it does need to be done within a structure that respects other countries and that does understand. Americans don't like the word multilateralism. It has too many syllables and ends in an ism. And so, but the bottom line is it's just partnership. And so I think we gain by that. And so I think that model works. But I truly do not think we are the most powerful country in the world. We have a little bit of a screwed up economic situation at the moment, but we are the most powerful country. But we need to do it in combination with other countries, and that's the model that I think comes out of the end of the 20th century.
And still true that we need to know where we're going in that we ultimately have to have a clear direction to drive that concentration?
Well, I think the issue, and one of the issues in Bosnia, is what is national interest? And there are lots of ways to define it. The question is whether it's just geostrategic or whether it also has a moral component to it. And I do believe that American values, in terms of not letting people be massacred and ethnically cleansed and all this, is part of our national interest. But everybody defines it a little bit differently, and it takes exactly that kind of leadership to explain it. And why would you want to put people in harm's way because something is happening somewhere else? And you can either explain it because it does affect us ultimately physically, or it does affect our moral values.
General, real quick, is the way we exert leadership in the world today, should it be different than it was at the point of Dayton and Bosnia?
Well, it is going to be different because the power relationships are different. But I want to just reinforce the idea of the indispensable nation. I think America's still the greatest power, still has the greatest values, still has the greatest credibility. We deliver, and we still are the indispensable nation. But others have more capacity to contribute. And one of the things we've got to do is find ways to engage them with us and get their contributions.
Peter, you've been up close at some of our greatest successes and our greatest setbacks of the last 20 years. What's your thought about how the nature of our leadership today and how it compares to, say, in the Dayton period?
I think the Dayton period and frankly the leadership of President Clinton was unique. Inevitably, America's relative position in the world was going to decline. I think the previous administration accelerated that decline with some very poor choices in terms of places that it pursued issues. I think one of the other lessons of Bosnia and the wars in the Balkans is just how interconnected we are as people on this planet. There was a hope on the part of policymakers, the first Bush administration that didn't want another foreign policy venture in an election year, that they were in trouble. The beginning of the Clinton administration on the part of many who wanted to focus on other things, that we could set this aside. And that interconnected world, and Christiane Amanpour, who was originally going to be the moderator, but is in Egypt. I thought to some degree she and Dick Holbrooke might share the Nobel Peace Prize, because she really exemplified a press that put what was happening in Bosnia in our faces. We saw that the people who were being shot at by snipers were not some faceless people. They were, women in high heels, children, people who looked a lot like us. And so I think that's very important. And again, we live in a world where we have this kind of immediacy with what's going on in Egypt, right on the square. So I think that is another of the big lessons of Bosnia.
So it's really a milestone in recognizing our shared humanity.
Yes, it is.
I think I can speak for everyone in the audience when I say this has just been an incredible tour, not only of the immediate issues with Dayton, but of the entire world horizon. So will you join me in thanking this terrific panel?